and welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell. We're happy to be back with you again this week with Sophia Howlett. Sophie is the president of SIT, School for International Training University, here in town, right here in Brattleboro. It's been here since the 60s. She's recognized worldwide as a policy researcher and consultant, a scholar, and a teacher, and as a higher education leader in the United States and transnational environments, including overseeing human rights activities in Eastern Europe. With a strong background in philosophy and literature, both classic and non-mainstream, Sophie is a lifelong fan of myths, epics, folklore, and science fiction. We're happy to have you here, Sophie.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me on the show. I'm so thrilled I can be here with you all.
Well, we're so glad, you know, because for many reasons. One is that I think you're going to give us a new look at SIT. As I told you earlier, I've been in the community for over 40 years and never really knew it was a college and/or university. And so to understand more about what SIT is, I think that we understand that, or we know that the Peace Corps was there very early on. So anyway, you can enlighten us as to all of this, and we'll get to it after we find out about you.
Okay.
So you're born and raised in England?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And you went to school there as well?
I did, in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. I was actually adopted. And I grew up with an amazing family in Bury. My mum was a ballet teacher, and my father worked in an architect's office. And I have an older brother, but there wasn't a big tradition in terms of going to university or anything. So I was very fortunate. They realized that they had a slightly odd child, shall we say, early on. And they helped me really take an educational pathway that was going to allow me to explore my interests. I wanted to study Latin and classical Greek and all of those things. And eventually I announced that I wanted to go to Cambridge, which was actually a local town, only half an hour away. But in those days, the government paid for everything for folks, any folks actually, pretty much, including our room and board if you had the circumstances where you couldn't afford it. And so people like myself, first generation, without that tradition of education in the family necessarily, was able to go, because of an incredibly supportive family, mum and dad, and having those opportunities. So I went off to Cambridge and I studied English literature. And then eventually I said, okay, PhD. I remember very clearly my mother just looking at me and sighing and saying, "Really, Sophie? Haven't you done enough?" And I went off and did my doctorate at the Medieval Centre at York University, otherwise known as King's Manor, which is a phenomenal place for medieval and Renaissance studies in the United Kingdom. So yeah, it was a wonderful time of opportunity, shall we say, in terms of education. Yes,
and you also had some music in there as a child, right?
I did, lots of music and lots of drama. My parents would probably say that the drama was both on and off the stage, and because I was very strong-headed, shall we say, knew what I wanted, and so there was French horn playing from quite an early age. My mother desperately tried to put me in front of a piano, which I just found phenomenally boring. And I heard one day the sound of a French horn in a wind group, and I said, that's it. And it took a few years again to persuade my parents, because it was like ladylike, piano was ladylike. French horn, what is that? But eventually I started with the French horn. And I really played wherever I could, octets, quintets, quartets, the Suffolk Junior Symphony Orchestra, school, everything. Again, wonderful time for opportunities.
Yes.
I also used to do a lot of drama. I did a lot of work on stage, comedy, character roles. And then eventually I sort of migrated in my 20s into directing more. So yeah, lots of hobbies, lots of interests.
Yes, and they carried through as well.
Absolutely.
Do you still do music?
I still do music,
Yes.
but mainly to myself. I think everybody will be relieved to know. I was really excited to be asked to do a kind of horns-off sound for our Wagner in Vermont festival a few
Yes.
years back.
Uh-huh.
But since then, I have restarted classical guitar, which is an instrument I took up in my 20s. And I thought, you know, COVID was the perfect moment to do something very, very soothing. You know, so you have tough meetings at work on Zoom, and then you just chill out for 10 minutes with the guitar. So
yes, we're gonna touch on the pandemic a little bit later.
Please do.
Yes, I know. Were there other influences? Were there people who influenced you as a child, or I know that you were a reader as a child too.
Big reader.
Big reader.
So yes, I was always hiding from the rest of my family so that I would have time to read. Because again, my mother was very into, you need to get out more, you need to be healthy. And my brother is also very, you know, he was more interested in getting out there and being more sociable. And I'm more of a classic introvert extrovert. I recharge by reading and being on my own. So big reader, and I really caught that passion from my father, who started reading to me when I was very young. And he read to me The Borrowers, and he read The Hobbit, and really opened up all these different worlds to me. I was about 7, I think. And I'd been given a book token to go to the bookshop, the children's bookshop in Cambridge. And they took me, you know, day out with the family right after Christmas. And it was very cold, and I could see this beautiful place, this college in front of me, and there were people going in and out. And I remember I was holding my dad's hand and said, you know, what's that? Who are those people? And he told me, and I said, that's what I'm going to do when I grow up. And really, that was it. I always knew then, from then onwards, that I wanted to be an academic. I wanted to spend my time, preferably in a library, and writing books and contributing to research, just being, shall we say, the universal student. So that was big. And then I think the other person who was really important to me was a quasi-uncle. I think everybody's got those folks growing up, you know, family friends. The best friend of my father, actually, his name was Ray. And he was from New Zealand, and my father and him had digs together, shared an apartment together when they were young. And my Uncle Ray lived to travel. And he was always off doing crazy things. And he was, you know, he would have a stopover in Jordan, and he would rent a donkey and go and look at Petra. You know, he would spend months going around India. When he was actually in England, you know, he would have a sort of a fairly menial job somewhere, and then would take sick days to go off and see some beautiful art exhibit. And he was somebody who I would listen to him for hours. He would come back from wherever he'd been and show us all these photos and talk about these amazing things he'd seen.
So you started seeing a wider world very early on.
Absolutely.
And do you think that influenced you? Because you went on to study philosophy as well as English literature.
Correct.
At some point, though, it seems like the global view came in, the idea of taking things globally, which sounds like it must have been a huge step. How did that come about for you?
Well, I think, first of all, as I said, there was that Uncle Ray always in the background with that passion for travel. And secondly, my mother, who was maybe that dichotomy I discussed was always there in my parents. My mother was the practical one. My father was the dreamer and the book reader. And so my mother, from an early age, she would organize these amazing holidays. I had a number of health issues when I was a kid. And so, you know, the doctors were always saying, you have to get it by the seaside. And after about 4 years of British seaside and being rained out, my mother kind of gave in and started organizing these holidays at a time when nobody in England really went overseas. And so we would go somewhere. She'd take me and my brother for 3 weeks, so I got as much of the sun and sea as possible for my health. And we would self-cater, and we had these amazing adventures. And so we went to Spain, we went to France, we went to Italy. And my mother, I just was always thinking when it was time to go, what if I could live here, right? What if this could be my life? And so I guess that was always at the back of my mind.
Right.
But then I think it was probably about 1993. And the Bosnian War, I don't know if all your viewers will remember, but the Bosnian War and the civil war in Yugoslavia, and there was a genocide occurring at the time. And it was the first war in Europe since the Second World War. And I grew up in a generation where at school you learned about the Holocaust and the Second World War. And there was always this question out there, which was, what would you have done? Right? When you saw how people were treated and people trying to hide others, help others, what would you have done? And so with the Bosnian War, I felt that that really was that question to me. Here is something that's happening on my own continent, in my own backyard. What am I doing? And so rather sadly, I looked around, there I am. I have a PhD in European Renaissance philosophy and literature. And I'm writing to the Red Cross saying, I can type, you know, because I don't know what to give and I don't know how to go about being supportive and answering that question.
Yes.
And so eventually I happened to see in the back of a newspaper an advert for an organization called Civic Education Project that I didn't know it at the time. It was set up, funded by George Soros. Set up out of Oxford and Yale to send professors overseas to support post-Soviet countries in Eastern Europe. So that wasn't Bosnia per se, but it was really a kind of it was one answer to the what are you going to do?
That's right.
So I felt it was the right time. As I said, I got tenure early. I was very lucky. And so I applied to them and said, all right, I'd like to take 1 to 2 years and volunteer. A bit like Peace Corps for professors in many respects.
Interesting, yeah.
And, you know, they said to me, well, what can you do in terms of where you can go? And I said, well, I think I can talk about the Renaissance in Prague, for instance. And they said, well, okay, but what about talking about the Renaissance in Kiev, Ukraine? And I was like, you know, I don't know anything about that, but give me a minute and I'll work it out. And so they sent me off to Ukraine. And I suddenly found myself, I couldn't read Cyrillic. I had no language, but, you know, I was living in this amazing place at this amazing time. And it really transformed the pathway of my life in many respects.
You have a tie, some kind of a heart connection with Ukraine.
Oh.
So this must be a hard time for you.
Shall we say I empathize with the people of Ukraine in a way that, I mean, I'm sure we all do. But yes, there's, you know, there's something about the first country you ever live overseas in. It's where your heart always is.
Also knowing that you've been on NGO boards, done the human rights advocacy, you created one of the first LGBTQ networks in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
All of this stuff, I can see how it's informed you and brought you to SIT. Can you talk a little bit about coming to SIT? And because it's been 5 years now.
Yes, it has.
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, we had a pandemic in the middle, which you can certainly refer to. But I'd love to hear what your feelings are about it and what I'm sure you've got a plan of action, because you sound like a plan of action kind of person.
There was a plan of action,
yeah.
I can assure you.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a vision and there was a plan of action. I think it was a process. I remember I saw the ad, and at the time I was actually looking for a provost position, because I was an associate provost of a sort of medium-sized 16,000 students state school, but very values-driven, African-American serving, 90% Pell, Hispanic serving, veterans serving, you know, and it was the sort of place that I was very passionate about, particularly around state education. So SIT, you know, came up and I thought, what's that? And I must admit, I hadn't been looking at private schools.
Yeah.
You know, because as I said, my passion was really about the values-driven education. And, you know, private is a complex place to be when you're thinking about values, because you also have to survive and you have a slightly different mission dimension.
Right.
So I took a look at SIT, and they were looking for a president. And something was tickling at the back of my brain. And I couldn't work out why I was so interested to learn more. And then I suddenly realized that a very dear friend of mine, she went to this place on a hill in Vermont. And I wrote to her and I said, hey, and I'm going to name check her here, Shannon, is this where you did your master's degree that you kept going on about and like has really taken you far, and the place you chose was really interesting and cool? And she said, yes, SIT, why, what about it? And I said, oh, nothing, you know, because I didn't want to let on, you know, that I was applying to her alma mater. And I thought, wow. So I did some reading, and I also looked around at some of my other friends and my Facebook contacts and my LinkedIn contacts, you know, and you suddenly discover that something like half or maybe more of the people that I have made friends with or worked with over the years have an SIT connection.
Oh, how interesting, yeah.
And then that was when I thought, hang on, I recognize you. And so then it was really about persuading them that they recognize me. Because this really was the moment for me, in terms of my background, to make a sort of a little bit of a left turn, as I said, out of the sort of place that I had been working in into a place that is a lot more complicated to explain to people. You know, and I'm not surprised that not everybody understands us or gets us, and that's part of my job to try and communicate that. But it is very recognizable to me with that kind of the connection between the values, the global, the academic quality, the wanting to be ideas driven, but in a unique way, you know. So this to me is the whole package of what SIT is. And it really felt like a natural fit for me. They were very upfront with me that there were some issues, you know, and I didn't know much at the time about small colleges and some of the problems confronting them in northern New England and even in Massachusetts. Look at Hampshire, Mount Ida, etc. I didn't know much about that. It hadn't been my world. And they started describing some of the issues. And I was just like, look, you can't put me off. This place is the sort of place where I think I could call home. And I came in, and yes, there were some issues that we needed to deal with.
And how do you feel about the progress of that over these 5 years? I'm sure you've worked long and hard.
Yes. Well, I did feel very good about it pre-COVID. We really had a massive turnaround. So it's now a good moment to give you a little bit of the history of SIT, because it's a complicated world, and I just want to give that sense, the context. So first of all, as you said quite rightly, SIT has been around since the 60s. We were actually founded, accredited as an institution of higher education in 1964, which means that we're going to be 60 years old in 2024, and we're looking forward to celebrating that. However, there has been so much more going on before that. And many people in Brattleboro, they're probably sitting there thinking, well, hang on, how does this connect with the experiment or world learning?
Exactly.
So the fact is, it's all the same thing in many respects. So we like to talk about world learning SIT. World learning started as the experiment in the 1930s. Donald Watt out of Putney was taking kids overseas. One of the kids that he took was Sergeant Shriver. And then in the 1960s, when Sergeant Shriver was asked by JFK to create the Peace Corps, he phoned up Donald Watt and said, how do you do this, right? How do you build the sorts of skills and the language acquisition to send these volunteers all over the world? And so Donald Watt and Sergeant Shriver, they got together on the Hill and they said, all right, we're going to train PCVs, Peace Corps volunteers, here first before we send them out. And in fact, we had a beautiful ceremony this summer in August, right after graduation. We had our blue marker, the director of the Peace Corps came up, Peter Welsh came up, everybody was there. So nice. And we inaugurated our blue marker as the primary training site for the Peace Corps. So SIT, as an accredited higher education institution, was born out of a Peace Corps training program. So, and eventually then the name got changed into World Learning. So we still have the experiment, but it's focused on high school kids. SIT is the accredited higher education institution, as you said, our university. And World Learning is our NGO, it's the whole thing. So, and together we're World Learning SIT, and we've been here for a very long time, 90 years strong.
I went out on the site and I finally understood that there's an umbrella going on here, and that was very elucidating. It was very helpful to understand that. Also, I know that it started up in Putney, on the hill in Putney, where Greenwood School is now, and where the campus is currently is one of the most beautiful places in town.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Just beautiful. Yeah, it's on Kipling Road. And can you say something, Sophie, about the campus? Because it's, I know over the years it's been very lively with people from different countries coming and going. What's the state of it these days?
We have all our admin is still based there. So I think right now, I'm trying to remember, probably about 125 staff consider Brattleboro, Vermont campus as their what we call base of designation. They may not all be working there all the time because of various things, but that is their base of designation. So it's our administrative center. It is also the administrative center of the whole of World Learning. So that's our heart and soul. Throughout the summer, we have all of our summer programs and events, and that goes on from, say, June all the way through till August. When most years, when we're not hit by COVID, we also have a fabulous jamboree, and we have all the faculty across the world come, and we have taken them down to the river gardens before it was Marketplace, and you know, we try to get people out and about in town so everybody can meet people. But then we added on a third component this past year of the refugee support, so that during the academic year, it's not only our admin home, but it's also through our collaboration with ECDC and BDCC, it's also acting as a home for incoming refugees so they can get on their feet. We provide cultural orientation and English orientation and keep providing English language throughout the year. And we provide temporary housing until they're ready to find their feet and find somewhere.
And you've been able to accommodate that. So that's saying a lot about the viability of SIT.
Oh, yes. If you think of what you see in Brattleboro as the tip of the iceberg, right? Because most of SIT you can't see. You know, you can see it on YouTube or something, or Facebook, but you can't see it visibly most of the year. So we're in about 45 countries at the moment, and we have programs all over the world. We run semester programs at the BA level, we run summer programs at the BA level, we run college prep programs with the experiment, and we also run masters, and we also have a doctoral program, so which is why we're now becoming a university, because we really are truly comprehensive, and also we're not just soft social sciences, but we've moved into things like public health and climate change and environmental science. So when I came in, the grad school was the tip, and it had, I think in the early 2000s, really expanded out. There was maybe about 200 students on the Hill a year. They were living there, they were working there. Probably the folks watching this program will remember seeing students all over town, just like Marlborough. And that was on a decline. And so by the time I arrived, I think we had maybe about 70 students on the Hill. And unfortunately, because of the decline, we were losing a massive amount of money.
Right.
And we were essentially utilizing our undergraduate programs, all the students overseas, and that used to be, and still, well, I mean, we're growing back to it, but it used to be about 2,000 students a year, let's say, ballpark of about 2,000 undergraduates. And then there had been those 200 or so grads that had then diminished down. So we had the small number of grad students, the big undergraduate programs, and essentially the undergraduate programs was subsidizing the grad school. Now, as you can imagine, that's okay for a year or two, but eventually people start saying, well, hang on, you know, I'm making all this money for the institution. I would like to see some of that money coming back into my programs and to my experience. So we knew that we had to do something with the grad school. And then unfortunately, it started to get worse. And it was not only taking up any of the additional income of the undergraduate programs, but also world learning as a whole. And so that was the moment when we had to kind of get into gear and make some big changes. And so the change that we made, which I can tell you was a really horribly difficult one, was to take the programs that were happening on campus during the academic year, that's September to May, off-site and put them out into the world. So not so great for the Brattleboro, you know, context and our faculty here, but I have to say an amazing opportunity for many of our prospective students and also for our programs that are out there. So, for instance, instead of doing international education for a year in Vermont on the Hill, instead now they do international education first semester in Spain and second semester in Vietnam and then third semester anywhere they want in the world. So it's really a kind of idea of experiential learning, which is like immersing the student in these different contexts and learning on site. So I said, different educational model. What I was aiming for when I came was to really run that model alongside keeping things on the Hill. But once the financial situation started to impact the entire organization, you know, unfortunately, you're kind of too late and you have to make those decisions.
Right, and so where it stands now is you still got this vision, I assume, and you're tweaking it and you're shifting it around a little bit.
It was working beautifully.
Before COVID.
Before COVID
Yes,
hit.
right. So we're just going to keep our eyes and ears open to hear what the next steps are going to be, because you are part of the community, and it sounds like you're going to be a larger part of this community.
Well, that's the aim.
Yes, that's the aim.
And I will say that, you know, you said I've been here for 5 years. So my first term was 4 years. You know, and that ended up being all about the grad school and then COVID. And I've just started my second term. And so there is a new strategy. It's very forward-looking. It's ambitious. It's a vision to take us to 2032. And it's a 4-year strategic plan to lay the foundations. We're still in recovery from COVID. And that's key. But, you know, we are also laying the foundations for a lot more. So we mentioned the issue around the university. We mentioned something I haven't mentioned is the idea of creating a new paradigm for what a global university can be. That, you know, we're not talking about, you know, some sort of colonial vision of a US university that goes into other countries or whatever. We're not talking about some online university. We're talking about a genuinely networked university, decentralized, where the leadership and the faculty can be anywhere they want. Right now, I'm delighted to say that during COVID, my new provost is based in Morocco. His associate dean for undergraduate programs is based in Uganda. The associate dean for the grad school is based in Ithaca, New York. So as well as the folks who are really based in Vermont. So the idea is that we embrace a kind of a decolonized notion of what a university can be, a true global institution. So as you can tell, I'm very passionate about
Well,
that.
it's very exciting to hear you talk about this, because I think there's so much change that everybody's undergoing in every facet of our civilization, basically right now. But to hear this about college, university, and global thinking is really heartening. And I think that I can see how SIT is a place for people to look at to see what that can be like. It's wonderful to hear you talk about it, Sophie.
Well, you know, in the years that I've been global, shall we say, one of the big disappointing things to me is the lack of a truly progressive vision of globalization. It got taken over by a kind of neoliberal ideology. And so, you know, people who would truly see themselves as progressives, trying to do something different that's values driven, they kind of moved away from globalization because they figured that that was not the arena. So how can we turn that around and reinvent it?
That's a question we're all asking right now. How can we turn this around and be more inclusive more than anything else? Very exciting to hear what's happening. Wonderful to know that that campus is still viable and vibrant and beautiful.
Yes, very beautiful.
I encourage folks to check out SIT online as well. And we look forward to Wagner in Vermont again, perhaps, with you. I know we didn't get to really talk about it, but I do encourage people to check out the Latches. You did a wonderful lecture of Wagner in Vermont Festival. Very interesting, and it's more in the philosophical vein of your life.
You know, we didn't get to talk about that at all, really. But I will say that, yes, they're doing it again next August. I hope they're going to ask me to do another lecture, because there's nothing I like better than actually doing something cerebral and communicating with people about some of my passions.
Well, you do a great job, and you really make it accessible for folks too. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being part of Here We Are. It's wonderful to have SIT on the radar again, and we'll be tuning into that. And also, on a personal note, we're saying goodbye to our technical director, among many other things here. Brian Bashaw is leaving BCTV. We are, I'm not going to say that I'm heartbroken, but it's very sad for us to see him go. We know that he's going to do really well wherever he goes, but he has been such an asset and so wonderful to have on this team. And we'll miss him greatly. So thank you, Brian. And thanks again to all of you for tuning in.